Tony Gosling is an investigative journalist who joins us from Bristol. Tony Gosling, welcome. So for the first time, maybe ever, as far as we recall anyways, you have the War Cabinet meeting that occurred in Israel when the U.S. President went there, and he was in that cabinet meeting, which point by many analysts' statements to the fact that Israel is going to go ahead with another major operation, which all fingers are pointing to that ground operation. Tell us the more active role that the U.S. has partaken here, which is unprecedented in itself.
Well, of course, the United States has been financing Israel since the Second World War. Massively important because they couldn't continue to do all these atrocities without all those finances coming over from the United States. But it was interesting watching the meeting between Biden and Netanyahu. You could see the body language. Biden was almost sort of edging around him. You didn't need to say anything. It's quite clear that Biden was looking at him, even though he's been told to go over there and say whatever it is he's got to say to support the Israelis in these appalling atrocities. But you can see he doesn't trust Netanyahu 1 inch. He's been put in a difficult position. I think if you had a strong US president, they would never have gone because, of course, the Israelis will be trying to use this visit as a publicity stunt. You know, this is and it's unprecedented. I believe I've never seen a trip by a major Western power, the United States or the United Kingdom, to that part of the world. For example, we had a visit by King Charles not so long ago when he was Prince Charles. The idea that they will not be allowed into these other countries and they won't get an audience. We also saw the Saudis telling Blinken that they wouldn't see him, so he had to wait until the morning to see the Saudis. It's quite obvious the whole Arab world is sending every message it possibly can diplomatically to the United States that they've got to condemn. And the reason for this is because the US president has just simply one thing, refused to call for a ceasefire. Now, obviously, that would be directed pretty much entirely at the Israelis. And that's why I imagine he's been instructed not to call for one. But it would be rather simple, wouldn't it, for any human being to stand up on a platform in any part of the world, particularly in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, and to say, let's have a ceasefire, as we can see how dangerous this situation is. But Biden didn't find it within himself to do that, and he didn't have the courage to stand up against the deep state and the United States. I'm afraid he doesn't represent the US people at all. He's not really a democratic person, because if he was, that's exactly what he would call for. He's neither a humane person, otherwise that's what he would call for. Even a child would call for a ceasefire at this stage, but President Biden couldn't manage to do it, and which is why he's been entirely shunned by the Arab world.
Well, you talk about how the U.S. President Joe Biden didn't want to give Netanyahu an inch, but and this is speculation, but don't you think that Netanyahu wants to use that inch in order to pull the U.S. into a war, which I think his obsession and dream is to pull Iran into it, but it's going to first start with Hezbollah and then move maybe towards Iran. Is that maybe the type of game plan that Netanyahu is devising?
Well, it's been the unhinged game plan really ever since the Rabin assassination in the 1990s. And in fact, if you go back even 50 years to the Yom Kippur War, the Israelis, if you look at the military history of that, the Israelis fell back to give confidence to the Arab states, and at which point there was a major battle, and there were a lot of tanks, etc., involved in that war. But always the object back in 1973 was to get the US to come in and help, which of course they did. And I think this is yes, the unhinged game plan of the Likud party, the right-wing leadership that call themselves Jews. I wonder, many Jews around, my Jewish friends, are all appalled by their behaviour, so they certainly don't represent all Jews. And we've had the Neturei Carter in London, Rabbi David Feldman, at the weekend saying they don't represent Jews. This is a fascinating angle, because he is always saying, Netanyahu, that we represent the Jews of the world. They don't. This is, you're absolutely right, a game plan, a hideous and a twisted game plan in order to create a conflict which will drag the United States in behind Israel. So yes, it's extremely dangerous, tense moment, and it's very heartening to see that Biden has got such a frosty reception in the Middle East.
Yeah, and I said that, and I posed that question because Netanyahu has had this obsession with regards to Iran. But we don't want to put the focus just in this case on Iran in terms of what has happened between Israel and Palestinians. The way that the U.S. is approaching this, I'm wondering why it's void of any diplomatic overtures, unless they tried it with the regional countries, which it appears that they have, but they're getting pushback. But to put our focus on Egypt and Jordan, they're on the U.S. payroll. Why is it that the U.S. is proposing to them to uproot the Palestinians and then sending it to those countries, in particular Egypt, to send it to Egypt? The Sisi rejected that, from what we understand. I mean, do they really think that Palestinians would go for that, or do they want to make that not a choice, but that something that is going to happen?
Well, the Israelis may force the issue, we'll see. But at the moment, there's lots of negotiations going on. There's lots of brinksmanship, there's lots of threats. I mean, there are a lot of lies. The Israelis, IDF, said they were going to go into Gaza militarily straight away. They didn't. They've also said that they weren't behind the attack on the Ali Arab hospital yesterday. What they quite clearly were. They can't even get their story straight on that. We keep hearing different versions of why such a massive missile or bomb or whatever it was blew that hospital up, 100 or so times bigger than any of these Hamas rockets. And the Israelis, one minute they're saying, oh, well, it was an extra bit of fuel in the rocket that maybe made it a bit bigger. Another minute they're saying, oh, the Hamas had a secret ammunition dump in the hospital. They can't even get the lies straight. And so that's what I think is going on here. And with Egypt, they're holding on, I would imagine. Of course, they are really a client state of the United States, as you say, but they're holding on to try and get a deal whereby either the Jordanians will take more. I must say I was really impressed with the Jordanian performance at the UN Security Council. You can see what's happened. Over the years, many of these Arab countries have taken the Yankee dollar, so they've done all sorts of things to get the American oil money, the petrodollars, etc. But it's come to it over the last couple of weeks that I'm afraid people like the Jordanian king are just saying, well, we're not having any more to do with the Americans. Well, we're not certainly going to be pushing, because our own people are telling us what they wanted to do, and they're representing their own people for a change at last in this horrific situation in Gaza.
Yes, and isn't that a game changer in a sense? Because you're getting the countries that are united now against Israel.
Absolutely. Well, it could be. And Netanyahu is getting hemmed in, isn't he? The problem with him, and one of the things we don't see, certainly here in the UK, I'm not sure about in the Middle East, is all the demonstrations that have been going on in Tel Aviv by Israelis, ordinary Israelis. They have been, of course, all year against Netanyahu. But what we're seeing is demonstrations outside the Defence Ministry this week. We've seen demonstrations outside just general out in the streets against, first of all, by the families of the hostages, for example, saying, come on, let's negotiate. What the Israelis have done is they've taken a specific couple of families and they've put them on the TV who are supportive of Bibi's policy. But of course, the vast majority of people who had hostages taken from their families want an end to they want a ceasefire, they want to negotiate. In fact, that's one of the main reasons I would imagine that Hamas did this, is they've got to trying to force the Israelis to negotiate. And as for the number of casualties we've been hearing, there's been some fascinating stuff going on Israeli radio with people calling in talking about I think it was at the kibbutz Be'eri. Yasmin Porat is saying that the Israeli IDF actually killed almost all of the hostages as well as the Hamas fighters in her kibbutz. So there was no proper discrimination between who was getting killed in there. And you have to potentially translate into other situations. Were the IDF actually killing the hostages as well as they were killing the Arabs? She was one of the only two women that survived in that kibbutz from the Israeli side. So it looks as if the IDF have really got to be put back in the box somehow. And of course that would, what the Israelis are alleging is all these hostages have been killed by Hamas. Maybe many of them, maybe many more than we're being told, were actually killed by IDF soldiers in these kind of exchanges where they decided to try and release hostages, but just killed them all by mistake rather than negotiate. So the negotiations are absolutely key to this, and I think at some point the borders will have to be reopened. I would love to see the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announcing that the Royal Air Force were going to be flying bravely over Gaza, dropping food, dropping water, dropping supplies, so that the people can be fed, and medical supplies particularly, and also using their ships that are in the area, the radar, in order to make sure that there are no Israeli warplanes overflying Gaza whatsoever, and if they are, maybe even to shoot them down, because this is a potential situation which could be cataclysmic in a third world war, even dragging in the Americans, the Chinese, the Russians potentially. And we need to make sure that, I would say, a no-fly zone or something over Gaza right now is what the British should be enforcing, but of course they're not. They're just doing whatever the Americans want, and that is the American deep state, not the American people. And Joe Biden, I'm afraid, is one of the worst US presidents, the weakest US presidents there's ever been, and he looked as if, over in Tel Aviv today, he looked as if he didn't even know where he was, and he seemed to want to walk the other way.
All right, thank you so much. Tony Gosling, investigative journalist there from Bristol. Thank you so much.
Thank you.